The Super NES stands as one of the most revered consoles in gaming history, and for good reason. Its lineup is bursting with classics that stand the test of time. Tapping into the quality and nostalgia alike then, Nintendo has finally unveiled the Super NES Classic Mini, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. Well, aside from the potential scarcity of the thing. Today's episode of DF Retro then is a little different from usual. We're going to focus on the Super NES and its upcoming Mini Edition. Which included games stand out as showcases for the system, and what has Nintendo learned from the NES Mini? Beyond that, we're also going to look at the most impressive games, like Demon's Crest here, that didn't make the cut. So it's time to celebrate all things Super NES, or if you prefer, Super Famicom. Let's get started. Released late last year, the NES Mini was a decent little system, but it had its fair share of limitations. For one thing, video output was limited to just 1280 by 720, and scaling wasn't handled that well. None of the 3 available modes on the system even came close to holding up under inspection. So with the SNES Mini, we'd like to see support for a higher resolution output like 1080p and more scaling options this time around. Of course, the bar is higher than last time. With a stock Super NES, you can output RGB straight from the multi-out port, something that was not possible with the NES, without modding at least. So, for most users, the NES Mini provided a significantly better image than you could get out of a standard NES. Of course, your average customer isn't likely to have access to a scaler like the FrameMeister, so the HDMI-based SNES Mini is still likely to be a great option for them. Then there is emulation quality. The NES emulator included in the previous mini console wasn't bad, but there were subtle sound inaccuracies and various other little issues that stood out under testing. Things like this. Not a huge deal, but definitely something to consider. Now on the PC, SNES emulation is in great shape. Bu's excellent Hygan emulator, for instance, with its psycho-accurate SNES core, is one of the best emulators available, but it requires a beefy machine, the kind of hardware you're not going to find in a low-cost system-on-a-chip solution that will be used in the SNES Mini. The question is, how accurate does it really need to be for the included games? Alright, so now we're going to jump into those games, and as we look at them, note that all the video that you're seeing in this episode is captured from an original Super NES using an RGB connection. So unless otherwise noted, there will be no emulation used in this episode. Alright, so most of the games included with the system just run on a stock Super NES without utilizing any of the additional hardware within the cartridges. Games such as Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Final Fantasy III, Contra III, Castlevania IV, all of these are beautiful games, but they don't require any extra chips to run. Several of the games, however, certainly do. One fascinating aspect of console gaming that has long since disappeared then is the use of additional silicon within a game cartridge, designed to expand the capabilities of the console itself. A great number of NES games relied on chips such as the MMC series to deliver the visuals and audio you saw in later generation games. These chips were very low cost and basically a requirement if you wanted to push beyond, say, Super Mario Bros. The idea itself is fascinating and resulted in games which could surprise and delight the audience by introducing effects that would have been impossible on stock hardware. In Japan, for instance, Konami was the master of this on the Famicom, even going so far as to include a full-on 6-channel FM synthesis chip in one of its games, allowing the Famicom to produce audio like this. Pretty amazing, right? With the Super NES though, it was also possible to include additional silicon in the cartridge, but these chips tended to cost more and as a result, were less common.
Super Mario Kart, for instance, uses an NEC DSP chip referred to as DSP-1 for its enhanced math coprocessor functions designed to speed up scaling and rotation operations. Kirby Superstar and Super Mario RPG then make use of the SA-1, which contains a processor core based on the 65C816 16-bit microprocessor. Improvements include faster memory, a higher clock speed, new arithmetic functions such as multiplication, a command not available when using the stock CPU, memory mapping features, and new direct memory access modes such as bitmap to plane transfer. While the additional silicon enabled more complex games on the Super NES, this wasn't exactly something Nintendo highlighted in its marketing materials. Mario Kart wasn't advertised with DSP chip inside. Sure, Mode 7 was talked about a lot, but that wasn't an extra chip. But there was one major exception. I'm talking about the Super FX chip. The FX chip is a 16-bit RISC chip with DSP functions. The original version ran at 10.74 MHz and enabled the system to perform the necessary calculations required for 3D. The chip does not feature any special hardware for rendering polygons, however, and instead relies on the programmer to write their own software rasterizer. The Super NES by itself could never have handled these operations, and thus, this powerful addition played a role in the marketing of Star Fox back in the day.
You are witnessing a new technology. The first and only game powered by the Super FX microchip. Danger, danger, danger.
Despite this, Nintendo hasn't offered any Super FX powered games on its Virtual Console service just yet. With the SNES Mini, there are now 3 Super FX games included then. Star Fox, the previously unreleased Star Fox 2, and Yoshi's Island, the latter 2 games of which even used the Super FX2 chip. It's a new era for in-house emulation from Nintendo. The original Star Fox used the 10.74 MHz iteration of the Super FX chip, and unfortunately it runs at a very low frame rate. Despite that, the game is designed well enough that even today, it's still remarkably fun to play. The FX chip is used for most functions in the game then. We have full 3D objects with rotation and animation, as well as point rendering, which was used for stars and dots along the playfield, line segments for wireframe objects, and more. Filled, flat-shaded polygons are used for most of the game's visuals, while scaled sprites are used for objects such as the asteroids in this level. We even see light point-sampled texture mapping in spots. What makes this stand out even more is the way in which it was used. The stage design was remarkably ambitious for the era. In one stage, for instance, you transition from doing battle in space to flying inside an enemy vessel, gunning for its core. After dodging security gates, you blow up the core and escape in a massive explosion, with plenty of slowdown of course, but hey, it was amazing for its time. So the primary limitations with Star Fox then really are just the frame rate and the small display window. Regarding the SNES Mini then, this kind of brings up a question of accuracy. It's very likely that the emulator will opt to run the game at the correct speed and duplicate the experience as it was on real hardware, and really that's the correct default way to play it. But is it the best way? What if those limitations were removed and you could play Star Fox at a higher frame rate? Not only would this be possible in emulation, it's already possible on real hardware. Well-known console modder Drakon, for instance, has modified Star Fox to run overclocked at a much higher clock speed. While the game is still capped at a maximum of 20 frames per second, the fluidity is massively improved here, resulting in a more playable game all around. An option for this on the SNES Mini would add a lot to the experience, but, it's probably unlikely. We can dream though, right? Then we have Star Fox 2. Near-finished builds exist on the internet, but its creator, the ultra-talented Dylan Cuthbert, has noted that these samples are not up to the level of quality present in the later unreleased ROMs. Now this game uses the Super FX2 chip, and is capable of displaying much more complex visuals and scenarios than the original game, using a chip that is now over 20 MHz. Once the SNES Mini is released, we'll take a closer look at Star Fox 2, but for now, just know that it was originally designed for this faster chip in mind. It'll be interesting to see how it shapes up. Yoshi's Island, of course, was released, and stands as one of the best games on the system, and this too used the Super FX2 chip. The faster RISC hardware was capable of so many different types of operations, and many of them are used here. Yoshi's Island does make use of polygons in select sequences, and it looks great, but its usage is more focused on sprite scaling and rotation and other similar effects. The game is extremely heavy on special effects and animation. This is the kind of stuff that a stock SNES simply has no business pulling off, and even compared to the consoles that would follow in its wake, Yoshi's Island was gorgeous. This also marks another first. Until the SNES Mini, Nintendo had never re-released the original Yoshi's Island on any other platforms. If you wanted to play it, you were stuck with the Game Boy Advance conversion, which, while not terrible, is a downgrade from the original in many ways. The inclusion of Super FX-enabled games is a huge deal for the SNES Mini, made even more significant by the inclusion of the unreleased Star Fox 2. So yeah, the Super FX chip, it was pretty cool. But which other games included with the new hardware really showcase what the original SNES could do? Well, let's start with Konami. They were all over the Super NES back in the day with lots of original games and arcade conversions alike. Two of its best 16-bit games then were Contra III: The Alien Wars and Super Castlevania IV. Both ran on a stock system, which unfortunately means plenty of slowdown, but the visuals and creativity on display really helped make up for it. With Contra III, the series enjoys a nice boost in visual fidelity over the NES originals, or even the arcade games. Hardware transparency makes an appearance here when using a Super Bomb, for instance, and the full color palette of the SNES is put to use here with great tile work and parallax backgrounds that greatly enhance the overall presentation. Who could forget this sequence then? The scaled plane dropping bombs down on the map, reducing it to flaming rubble? Very cool stuff. And of course the large turtle boss here with its strange earth-shaking pixelation effect. SNES games sure love that effect. Now every Contra game would vary the perspective from stage to stage, right? And Contra 3 was of course no exception. So after the initial side-scrolling stages, you get overhead stages which make use of the system's Mode 7 capabilities. It may have felt a little unwieldy back in the day, but now it's actually pretty natural and easy to play. Contra 3 still holds up really well today and is just an absolute blast. And part of its appeal stems from its strange and unique atmosphere. And a lot of that stems from the excellent soundtrack and sound effects work. Which brings us to one of the more unique aspects of the Super NES, the sound module. Composed of the Sony SPC 700 8-bit CPU alongside a DSP unit with associated memory, among other things, this module is used to create the soundtracks and sound effects you hear while playing games on the system.
Now, the sound produced by the system is certainly not for everyone, but when done right, the results can really stand out. Until this point, game consoles typically relied on chips with digital noise generators, FM synthesis, or a mix of the two, often with an additional PCM channel or two. The programmer could use this hardware to produce unique and interesting sounds. This could result in some amazing sounding games when done right.
The Super NES, however, relied on sampled audio, basically pre-recorded digital samples along with basic noise generation. The SPC 700 and DSP could then add basic echo and reverb and generally modulate these samples into what you hear during the game. The system could play back just 8 channels simultaneously and was limited by 64 kilobytes of memory. As a result, composers and programmers often battled with memory trying to cram as much sample and program data in there as possible. Samples were often stored at a very high pitch, which required less memory, then pitched down and filtered by the hardware. Sound effects then were often created by using pitched instrument samples, and all of this was played back at just 32 kHz. What does all this mean then? Well, a very different style of audio compared to other gaming machines of the era. And Contra III showcases just how unique it can get. The tunes are catchy enough, but not necessarily in the traditional NES style. These are complex, layered tracks with many different sections. At the time, the deep backing track here really stuck out to me. Very atmospheric. And of course, many other games on the console use the audio capabilities to produce great tunes. Castlevania 4, another Konami joint, featured a more ambient score than the previous games in the series, and it sounded quite unique. It was also a beautiful game in its own right, with loads of parallax backgrounds in these stages, transparency in other stages, and entire sections built around showcasing the Mode 7 functions. It's a beautiful and unique installment in the franchise. Other examples of awesome audio on the Super NES include games such as Earthbound with its super strange Hip Tanaka soundtrack. Or how about Donkey Kong Country? David Wise did an incredible job exploiting the sound hardware to produce audio that greatly exceeds what most other games on the system offered. I mean, just listen to this. And speaking of Donkey Kong Country, this is another technical showpiece, but not necessarily for the reasons you might think. Yes, the introduction of sprites and tiles rendered on an SGI workstation was very impressive at the time and used as a major selling point, but it's the other ways in which Rare used the hardware that really stand out to us now. For one thing, we see copious amounts of line scrolling here in the background of many stages with a rich parallax effect that was not always especially common on the Super NES hardware. We also see the system's color and transparency effects used to create some rather atmospheric areas. Look at the way the color palette is shifted here to create the sensation of dusk. Or how about these water segments? The subtle ripples, rich parallax backgrounds, and great use of color really give the impression of swimming deep below the surface. The mine stage is another great example. These swinging lights use transparency function to create atmosphere, while the light cones themselves are using rotation to gently swing back and forth. There are all sorts of little tricks like this throughout the game. Even without the pre-rendered sprites, Donkey Kong Country would stand as a technically impressive Super NES game, and when you take the aforementioned soundtrack into account, it really stands out. Now, I could go on and on about the various other great games included with the SNES Mini, from the unbelievably incredible Super Metroid with its stellar soundtrack and great visual design, to of course The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which remains one of my favorite games in the series. Nintendo certainly brought out all of the classics here. But what about Capcom? Well, there are some stellar Capcom titles here. Mega Man X, for instance, is perhaps the best game in the X series and stands as one of my favorite Mega Man games ever made. It really felt like a next-generation take on Mega Man, which I suppose is precisely the intent here. I think Mega Man X also serves to highlight the improvements made possible by moving to 16-bit hardware. Take this for example, the playfield size. In the NES game, the screen could scroll either horizontally or vertically, but never both at the same time. This limited the size and scope of the levels present in each of the Mega Man games. Now, Mega Man X abolishes this limitation entirely with stages that can be multiple screens tall by many screens wide. This leads to much larger and more complex stages than was possible on the NES. Classic Mega Man games also primarily focused on tiles with 90-degree angles. However, Mega Man X, with its expanded memory, was able to include tiles of all different angles, resulting in more nuanced and complex level designs. This is another way in which the game exceeded the NES titles. So when most players think about 16-bit games, it's typically the visuals that come to mind first, but in reality, the increased power and memory really did allow developers to push out things like level design well beyond the scope of what the NES was capable of. This of course extends to things like fighting games. I mean, we have Street Fighter II Turbo here, which is a really nice port of the original arcade game. Of course, competing systems also tended to have very nice versions as well, like the Sega Genesis version here, or perhaps even the ultra-thick HUE card used for the TurboGrafx 16/PC Engine version. Still, the Super NES version has more parallax scrolling than the PC Engine and better sound than the Genesis, making it a very nice version of the game. We also see Super Ghouls and Ghosts from Capcom. Now this one really highlights the limitations of the stock CPU, unfortunately, as the performance is dreadfully slow in parts. It is a nice looking game, no doubt, but compared to the much faster port of the arcade game to Mega Drive, it ends up feeling rather sluggish. But its inclusion brings us to those games which did not make the cut for the SNES Mini. Games which are either of top quality or technical excellence, or both, that would have been great to see on the new console. The first of those that comes to mind is Demon's Crest. Now this was a game that flew under the radar back in the day, but now it's a real classic and would have made a better choice, we feel, than Super Ghouls and Ghosts. It offers excellent visuals with rich color usage, an incredibly moody soundtrack, and a non-linear structure. It's a perfect example of how to make use of the stock Super NES hardware. And it's also become rather rare and expensive these days, so this would have given users a chance to experience it anew. Another game that we would have absolutely loved to have seen here is Doremi Fantasy. This is a late Hudson platformer released only for the Super Famicom in Japan, and it just so happens to be a gorgeous and fun little romp. It's one of my favorite games for the system, actually. Doremi really sticks out with its use of color and animation. Soft shades and excellent sprite work hold up really well today, and in many ways it feels like a game that could have existed on the Saturn or the PlayStation. This of course extends to the audio as well. Doremi Fantasy features a mix of catchy tunes like this, but also completely ambient tracks that fully exploit the SPC 700, like this. It would have been an absolute pleasure to see this on the SNES Mini, and in fact it was actually released on the Virtual Console years ago, so it should have been easy enough to include if the desire had been there. Alright, so what else? Terranigma, perhaps? This RPG was part of Quintet's Soul Blazer trilogy, as fans have come to know it, but it never saw release in North America, just Japan and Europe. It already exists in English and would have made a fantastic addition to the system. Now, this next one maybe isn't the best choice for the system, but it does stick out as one of the more impressive games on the Super NES, technically speaking. I'm talking about the ultra-rare Rendering Ranger R2. It was developed in part by the creator of the Turrican series and aims to push the system to its absolute limits, with loads of on-screen sprites displayed during gameplay, all at a very stable frame rate. It's a pretty nifty little game, if a little repetitive. Oh yeah, how about one more odd one? Skyblazer, an interesting platform action game with loads of parallax scrolling going on. It was directed by Kazunori Yamauchi, you know, the guy behind Gran Turismo. Yep, he's the one that directed it. It's a neat little action game with tons and tons of levels in there, though it can become rather challenging later on. That's not to say that this type of game would have made the cut for the SNES Mini, it's just kind of one of those neat little action adventures that you don't really hear about any longer. And when we're thinking of sort of fantasy action games, where the heck is ActRaiser? That would have been an absolutely perfect addition to the SNES Mini, and it's really quite bizarre that it's not here. I mean, it's not really a tech powerhouse of a game or anything, but it's still really unique and a lot of fun to play. Would have been nice to see here, I think.
Alright, so that about wraps things up. Hopefully you enjoyed this visit to the world of the Super NES, and equally, hopefully Nintendo delivers the goods with the upcoming Super NES Mini. When that little box is finally released though, we'll be sure to review the unit proper and see how it stacks up. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.
On the next episode of DF Retro.